He was in no class that had more than 20 when he started. And now, as I said, he has several that have 24. No, by modern standards, that's considered a small class. I talked to the teacher who's teaching Fraser's Shakespeare class, and he taught last year in Beverly Hills Public High School, which, mind you, is supposed to be, once was considered a model public high school. And he said, God, what a relief to get to a school where the kids aren't standing in the back. You know,
standing.
Yeah, standing room in some places, and split days, you know, double shift days. It's no wonder none of the kids are coming out of public high schools with a reasonable education.
I thought they were going over here tremendously into program things, program instruction. So
You mean television, electronic teaching aids?
teaching machines.
They have some very sophisticated teaching aids, including, I suppose, teaching machines, but I don't think it, you know, again, it's a stopgap solution.
In other words,
The problem will just keep increasing on you. Your solution does not apply itself to the problem, really. It
No,
just applies
no.
itself to a symptom.
Well, no, I'm completely in agreement with you. This is one of my.
You know, it's
major
like if a fella has smallpox, you say, look, we can use makeup and cover those spots. Yeah, we can cover all these up, get them all covered up.
Yeah.
You know, you still got smallpox.
Yes. Well, I couldn't personally. I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, this is my soapbox. I was very interested. I didn't know about this till I came over here. This film's even being made. There's no previous publicity. But I was a bit frightened of it because one is that I think this is a very, very important thing, and I think to the average person, the average Maud and Harold in the street. They just don't. They just don't listen to things like the various documentaries on television, and they don't read the books that come out and so on. I mean, 90% of the population are completely beyond all this. I mean, the 10% of the so-called learned might be very interested in this, but the great majority, which really, in the end, are those which have to know about it, don't hear about it. But something like a picture like this can get a message across, which all the other things, no matter how scholarly they are and so forth, can't. And but unfortunately, I was very divided on hearing this because one, science fiction or science fact that I was reading in the blurb is something which so often is handled with such a feeling of embarrassed awkwardness.
Yes.
It's strange. That once you say it's science fiction, everyone starts overdoing things or underdoing things. It just this of course would be the thing like there's a real horror film, one of the most horrible things. What was the name of it? What was it called? Population Zero.
Zero
ZPG.
population growth. Yes.
ZPG with
Oliver Reed.
Oliver Reed.
Yes,
Yeah.
this to me, I mean, it just terrified me. I mean, one thing we don't need is that. You know?
No, because you know what? That's to me an excellent case in point. I thought the problem with that film, it was so bloody serious. You know, they were lecturing at one another, and everybody in the film was so concerned about it. If they'd all been really that concerned, they never would have gotten in that situation.
Yeah.
You know, and nobody seemed, and yet, curiously enough, they all seemed to have quite nice clothes, and live in the interiors. All looked quite nice to me, and. We were determined to make a film that was not an animated lecture. And one of the ways that I hope are arriving at this, is that the characters in the picture are unaware of the desperateness of their situation, by and large. Just as you probably read, you know, the human animal is remarkably adaptable.
This is a good and bad trait.
Yes, you know, you perhaps read in children born during the war in concentration camps weren't desperately unhappy in the camps. You know, I mean, that's just the way life was, and that's the way you lived, and you lived on beetroot soup and the odd potato. And the people that live in the streets and sleep in abandoned cars, and who make a living pulling with ropes empty truck bodies around full of stuff, or on pedicabs. They don't spend their time bemoaning their fate. They just live. It's not a very good, again, the quality of life is not marvelously enhanced, but they don't complain of it. The character I play, I can't remember if we spoke of this before or not, but I share this tiny apartment with an old man, and he can remember how it was. And he says, you know, you used to be able to get meat in the stores. You could lettuce, you could buy eggs in any store. I say, yeah, I know. You tell me that all the time, you know. And meantime, I'm shaving with a razor blade that then you have to put in your wallet because someone will steal your razor blade, if you know, and shaving in cold water, and, you know, dribbled into a tin cup because you got to carry the water up from the street, you know. And but you go on and talk about your job and other things, and if you have a life that is better than, in my case, the case of my character, better than the millions of people out in the street.
In this society, do people still know what lettuce is and so forth? Or is it just
I've heard the word. For example, my boss, the captain of detectives, chief of detectives in this precinct, is asking me about a girl that I've been questioning. And he says, what about her? And I say, like grapefruit. And he says, you never saw a grapefruit. And I say, yeah, you never saw her. And, you know, probably I never did see a grapefruit,
yeah.
But I've heard the word. I know what a grapefruit is supposed to look like.
Do they have problems like today? You think about overpopulation and whatnot. In that time, they just don't.
Well, of
care.
course, their life, you know, you don't have many problems if your life is reduced to a place to sleep and getting your water ration and your food ration. That really occupies all your time. You have no job anyway. There's nothing to spend money on except a few broken down plastic cups like they're selling in that street market set we have out there.
Yes, that's why I asked what that was. I think that was the market. But
Yes. Now, I play a desperately overworked detective who has a problem because I have a certain sense of responsibility to my job. Detectives are overworked today. They're not able to put the time on the caseloads they have. I talked to my superior in the story about a murder investigation. He says, well, look, you've been on that 2 days. And I say, well, I'm just beginning to get somewhere. And he says, look, since then there have been 347 people killed in New York, and we're not going to solve any of those murders either. So come on, get over in this other one and forget it. We're going to close that case. But, you know, you talk to real cops now, and they're desperately overworked and double-shifted and don't have time to investigate properly, and they let things slip. And it's one of the problems of a society, an overcrowded society, which we are seeing now. I am deeply convinced. The sudden upsurge of casual violence, I think, is a result of overcrowding. Again, you see this from the experiments they've conducted with rat populations in an environment of fixed size, in which, let us say, 100 rats live comfortably and productively and have a fine time doing whatever it is rats do. But if you increase the population in that colony to 200 or 500 and then 1,000, the rats you can, this is demonstrable, has been demonstrated. You find increasing incidence of anxiety, neurosis-prone rats, psychotic problems of various kinds, increase in sexual maladjustments of various kinds, cannibalism. Rats eat their young or trample on them casually and abandon them. And what we speak of now and bemoan, deplore, as the alienation that you see increasingly among people. The professor at Columbia University who was killed on the street by muggers, and people were watching and didn't do anything. The a few years ago, I guess you could even call it the Kitty Genovese syndrome, where this woman, Kitty Genovese, was killed in the parking lot of an apartment building in a courtyard.
Oh, yeah.
And it took 25 minutes to kill her. And she was running around hiding behind the cars while these young muggers were chasing her with knives. And she's screaming, and people are leaning out their windows watching. And didn't do anything. Didn't even call the police. This is alienation. And we find that in the story enormously increased. The character I play is an alienated man. He has, through most of the story, very little capacity to empathize with the problems of other people, as you or I would. But again, these are things that we try to deal with peripherally. Nobody comments on it in the story. He's going into a church to question a priest on a case. And on the steps of the church, he sees a woman lying dead, and a baby is tied to her with a rope, and the baby's crying, of course. And he checks, sees the woman's dead, and he picks the kid up and puts it under his arm and hands it to someone in the church. But with no expression of sympathy, he does it as a pragmatic thing to do. It's part of his, it's sort of street cleaning, part of his job as a cop. And he does it, but there's not a flicker of sympathy in his face for the child. He just does it as the thing that he's supposed to do. But I think the alienation between individuals, as I suppose as the physical crowding becomes closer, the capacity to really feel any kind of relationship with another human being becomes less possible. If you and I are sitting like this on the couch, we can think about one another's problems, and if I say, is that breeze too cold for you? Let me close the door, or whatever. Or will you have a drink too? But if there are 25 more people sitting on this couch, each one of us doesn't really finally give a damn about anybody else.
Except if they all move.
Yeah, if he could get, to get room for he himself to breathe, at any cost.
This kind of role actually has gone through your career quite strongly, hasn't it? I remember in Naked Jungle, the only reason you had this woman come was sort of to complete the furniture of the room and to be your wife, because you thought you needed a wife, so you would just send for a woman to come. Master of the Islands, you were a completely cold, remote person. Diamond Head, the same kind of thing.
Curious thing.
Do you enjoy playing this kind of role?
This is the kind of role that I have played from time to time. It's what my wife calls my hero heel roles. On the other hand, I have perhaps played a higher proportion numerically of men like Sir Thomas More or Thomas Jefferson or the Seed, who's I think a commoner, more commonly discernible thread running through the parts I've played, which rather surprises me, because in theory, obviously, well, in fact, an actor can only play a part that exists. I mean, unlike a painter or a poet or a novelist, he can't say, gee, this is what I want to do, and do it. You have to, somebody, in my case, I can control the content of the pieces I do to a large extent, but somebody has to be willing to make the film. Somebody has to say, well, all right, we'll pay to make this film, as Metro did in this case. But nonetheless, I would say fully 2/3 of the films I've made have to do with the problems of individual responsibility, the responsible man. This is, above all, what Man for All Seasons is about. It's the preoccupation of a man like Andrew Jackson, whom I've played twice. It finally is the thread that made the Cid, historically as well as in legend, one of the most remarkable men in the Middle Ages, his capacity to be the responsible individual. Curiously enough, individual responsibility seems to me a very unfashionable idea now. I'm surprised I've been able to make a living making so many parts about such men. Will Penny is a man whose only remarkable feature, he's an illiterate cowboy. He is, in no way distinguishable from just any other cowboy, except his concept of himself as a responsible man. He can't write his name, but when he's up in the line camp in the winter snows and goes out inadequately dressed and inadequately mounted to check the cattle that he was sent up there to check, and the woman says, "But what? It's a blizzard. What if you didn't go? Who'd know?" And he says, "I would." Both the Shakespearean films I've done, Antony and Cleopatra and Julius Caesar, Antony's problems. In the first, he solves it. In Julius Caesar, he succeeds in discharging his responsibility. Of course, the tragedy of Antony and Cleopatra is the collapse of the inner core, that his abandonment of his responsibilities, perhaps the largest abandonment by one man on record of the whole Roman Empire. But you're quite right, as my wife has remarked, that many times such men are rather harsh men.
And opportunistic. Antony certainly was.
Yes, this finally overthrew him, but he was superbly equipped, at least as well equipped as Octavius Caesar, to rule the Roman world. Perhaps only 3 or 4 men, Hadrian, Caesar, and Augustus, were in his league as leaders. The tragic flaw in Antony, of course, is his incapacity to resist his own pleasure, to sublimate, to render secondary his own pleasure.
It is interesting to me that he was the character that you, I believe, chose to play twice. I mean, I believe you chose to play him in Julius Caesar, chose to direct and be him.
Exactly.
And it's interesting because he has got this ruthlessness, but the streak of sensuousness too, which is not very noticeable in many of the other characters which you have been forced, if you like.
One of the reasons that I chose to play Antony, I've played him in Julius Caesar 4 times in all.
2 film versions.
2 film versions, once on television, once on stage. Is that with all the great tragic roles, the great Shakespearean roles, they being each of them really so totally beyond the grasp of any actor, they are larger than any actor. I think, especially as an American actor, where our opportunities to play Shakespeare are more limited, that the American actor is well advised to choose those roles to which he can bring the most equipment to begin with. Obviously, Antony is such a role for me. The other is Macbeth, which I've played several times. Hamlet is a part in which I would have to be fighting myself all the time. My size is against me in Hamlet, for one thing. It helps me in Macbeth, or Othello, let us say, or Antony. But you want someone rather more like as Gielgud was, whose Hamlet I will never forget in '37 when I was a kid. That is what Hamlet should be like.
You're talking of muscular size or height size?
Both, really.
Because David Warner played him brilliantly. I mean,
Yes,
he's very tall.
that's true. But he has a.
He's stooped.
He
and
seems.
Yeah.
He never looks his height.
No, and he doesn't seem. He's a tall man, but he doesn't seem a big man, does he?
No.
But this whole question of the sum total of parts has begun to preoccupy me, and I don't pretend to have all the answers to it. But
Because I noticed that in the 50s, like The Big Country, again you played a hard man, but he was very physical, but there was a warmth there. But I've noticed in the 60s you've been getting colder and colder, you know, your parts being more remote, and
I hadn't considered that.
particularly I think of Planet of the Apes. I mean, there was a man that was pretty revolting, selfish character.
Well, there was a self-hating man, a man who hated humanity so much that he literally fled it.
Yeah.
Physically fled the human race. The totally disenchanted, the Swiftian cynic. To me, the delicious irony of that story, though, was that he then finds himself in a situation where he is the sole defendant of the human race, of their capacities, and I rather relished that irony. I like to believe that's one of the reasons the film was successful, that so many people didn't go to see it merely because it had all these monkeys running around and interesting, exciting things happen, but that there was some serious content. Now, my man Thorne, which name, in terms of what you're talking about, which name I invented myself, by the way.
Yes, I believe that there's a different name in the book, isn't it?
Yes, I think Thorne is a better name. As I said, is an alienated man in this story. Now, in this society, not uniquely alienated as are all his fellows, each from the other. But what I hope the story will demonstrate is, in part, it's not what the story is about, but it's, if you like, what happens to my character, what my character is about, is the redemption of the man. I conceive of him as having somehow, although we do not perceive it through much of the story, been protected from the total alienation of the millions of people that live in the city with him by the fact, in the first place, he doesn't live under quite as desperate conditions as most of them do, because he has a job and at least a room. And he also has the companionship of this old man who remembers the world and talks about it all the time, which Thorne totally rejects, but it still rubs off. And finally he can say to him, "I love you," and can at last say to the girl, for the first time, the last time he speaks to her, although he's been sleeping with her through the story, the last time he speaks to her, the last words he says to her, "I love you." So it may be that that there are other textures in this. This indeed, you could say, was part of what happened. You mentioned Naked Jungle, which is as far back as these hero brute men I've played go in my career. That's sort of what happened to that man finally, isn't it?
Yeah.
Now the picture I did about pro football was again an example of a man with no capacity save the discharge of his professional responsibility, whose total being, physical and neural and mental, were poured into his capacities as a star athlete. And he, in that story, he was unredeemed, and that, but he's defeated too. He's brought down. I don't know. I don't think of myself in private as a cold man. I'm a very private man, but I think that's imposed by living for more than 20 years as a public person. I think that imposes, at least I believe it has on me, a certain distance. You look for ways to create privacy within a public life. And you look on your privacy not as a natural right, which everybody normally enjoys, but as a condition desperately to be sought and defended as cleverly and resourcefully as you can. But it certainly imposes a kind of distance on your personality and a certain wariness of casual human contacts.
Well, you say you're not really a public type person anyway. Well, maybe let's not use the word.
But I make my living as a public person. That's what I am.
Well,
I am a public person in the sense of I make...
profession is a public profession in the fact that the public view your work. I mean, they're always aware of you and your work. But the word I was reading was not so much public, but gregarious.
I'm certainly not gregarious, but the public has a right, or at least consumes of me, more than my performance. I am perforce available for public consumption every time I go into a restaurant or get on an airplane or go to the theater or stop at a stoplight, for God's sakes. No, this is, you know, I've lived with this for a long time. It simply is the way of my life. When my kids were tiny, I had to explain to them that I couldn't take them to Disneyland. You know, that they could go, but somebody else would have to take them. That there were a lot of things that we could do that other people couldn't do. That they could, you know, come to Spain and watch me capture Valencia, but that I couldn't take them to Disneyland. All right, this is a condition of my life, and obviously you adjust to it. There are, believe me, more advantages to it than there are disadvantages. But I make the point to demonstrate that there is more to being more of yourself is of necessity consumed than your performances.
Oh, yes.
Your simply being anywhere constitutes part of your life as a public person. You can't escape it.
Like going to a restaurant or a cinema.
Yes, you know.
But of course, the world that this film takes place in, of course, doesn't need sensitivity, doesn't need privacy. In fact, it really needs a breed of people that are insensitive.
Yes, are alienated.
You know, and in fact, all our education today, this interest in Eastern religions and people getting more, you know, caring about people in other lands, in fact, is the worst kind of education. We should be more brutalized. I mean, it's a terrible thing, but the world that we are moving into...
It really is laughable. The more you hear people talking about the individual right to, you know, do his own thing, to sing his own songs and go his own way, there are fewer and fewer ways that anyone can go alone. Of course, it's a question of space.
And the amusing thing is about foreign travel. You know, they say, "Oh, it was, you know, it was fantastic, but you know, it was all spoiled. It was all completely spoiled." And yet, if you know, they're wanting the people that live in these countries to have a higher standard of living, and yet when they go to the countries, it was all spoiled and commercialized. In fact, these people were enjoying what they were trying to give them. In fact, was taking away from what they wanted.
Exactly.
You know? And they just can't see the tie-up.
It's laughable. It really is.
But if I could go back to a point that Carl made earlier about science fiction or science fact films overdoing things, I'm thinking particularly, I mean, I've seen many science fiction films, most of which, I'd say 99% of which have been very poor, but I'm thinking particularly of the Omega Man. Now this, when it started, was a very interesting story of how a man, he's a self-possessed man, the fact that he's well-read, he's interested in history, and so he uses all this to try and save himself from going mad. And yet you have the baddies, who are these cowled, kind of sinister figures, which I mean, it completely destroyed the whole thing. They overdid it.
Well, it was a disappointment to me. I had quite high hopes for it because I think part of every man's fantasy is the last man on earth thing. You know, what would it be like to be the last man on earth? And could I find within myself resources to live totally alone? You know, one of the oldest novels in our culture, Robinson Crusoe, is really a last man on earth story. There have been hundreds of them, including some brilliantly done ones. The story interested me in those terms. It also presented to me, I thought, an interesting acting problem to play roughly a third of the picture talking to myself. Even on simple technical grounds, the way everyone talks to himself, but the way people talk to themselves is different than the way they talk to other people. You talk in broken sentences and odd repetitions and nonsense phrases sometimes, and to try and solve that problem within the confines of communicating meaning at the same time was interesting. I thought, frankly, that part of the story worked pretty well. This man in this bizarre, somehow macabre fortress he had set up with these incredible artifacts that he'd obviously looted from the Los Angeles Museum of Art and so forth. And going into the movie theater and running a reel of Woodstock.
Excellent.
Yeah.
In reciting the dialogue.
We've seen it 100 times, of course.
Yeah.
But I quite agree. The creatures just didn't work out. I don't see why they shouldn't have worked out in theory, but as often happens, you can imagine creatures of that kind
They were
with subtleties.
seen too much.
They were seen too much and too clearly.
Too clearly. And
Too clearly.
Sharper focus, yeah.
I had hoped somehow that we would be able to make them mostly seen the way you see something late at night if you're dozing and you think you saw a figure move in the corner and you didn't, but on the other hand it looked like a figure. And I don't know, one of the problems of being a filmmaker is you have to stay with the way your works have turned out. You don't get a chance to paint the canvas over with white paint and start all over. But it's a picture in other circumstances I would like to have tried again.
But do you think this film, too, is leaving out too much of the science fact and injecting too much science fiction? I'm particularly thinking now you've changed the ending from the original ending of the book, which just kind of petered out. It didn't have no ending. I can fully understand why you needed a much stronger ending. But I feel this shocking revelation at the end, this kind of horrible thing, is going to shock the audience so much that they will completely forget about the rest of the film.
Of course, it does relate, doesn't it? It
relates, but yet,
very...
but yet it seems to be like
it's
a group.
quite sequential, you'll agree.
But yet, it's a group of people doing this purely for greed. It isn't a government thing of saying, well, the only way we can make food is to use human flesh.
We discussed this at great length, and that's a very interesting point. And we had several versions where it was more, the government was quite heavily involved. And I said, look, if we're going to get into that, everyone is going to say, oh yeah, this is the big fascist establishment. That's the point they're making. And I said, let's not make it. I said, in the first place, in circumstances like this, obviously the governmental structure would be sliding into anarchy. There would be very little possibility of any action at all on a federal level, as happened, for example, in the last days of the Roman Empire. What happened? One of the problems of the Roman Empire, they weren't really conquered. It just began to get so big and unmanageable. I don't mean that they had a population problem, not such a close analogy, but they did have an enormous administrative backup, and I've read translations of letters from Roman authorities in Britain where they said, look, we sent a dispatch on this 6 months ago and we haven't heard anything. Now we've made the following decision and thus and so, and what the hell about it? And they never would hear. And so, for slightly different reasons, in the United States of our story in 2022, one imagines, although we never go into it, that they never hear anything from Washington. They vaguely hear about the governor of New York, because New York is the biggest, is probably, that's the only place he ever is, really. But where we do have a dialogue where my superior is interrogating me about some wanted criminals. They pursue, if we continue to crowd the planet with people, this is where we will come.
You think, I don't know, this is not only hypothetical but worthless because it's already been started, almost finished. But the thing is that not to have any bad guys.
That's what I hope it is.
Because the bad guys is everyone, really. I mean,
yes.
I should say everyone in authority and the people not in authority also, because they're not doing too much really either, really. I mean, it's the whole thing of hand setting. I mean, there's no really bad guys that form that. There's no one planning it. It's all. It
isn't some. You know, at one point we considered that it was let's make it like the mafia, but we tried not to do that. That it is something that the governor is aware of, and at a certain point he says, "Look, do what you have to do. I don't want to know. I can't know any more about it." And certainly there are criminals involved in it, and there are wealthy businessmen, the tiny, minuscule fraction of people who can be wealthy in this society involved. But it's not big business, it's not government, it's not the mafia, it is inertia. People, as this character says, it seemed to be the easiest way, you know. I'm not persuaded that will be counterproductive in the modern phrase. I hope it won't anyway. You can't tell until you see it all work together.
You couldn't conceive just having filmed the book as written, that you had to introduce a whodunit structure, basically.
Well, of course, the book, if you remember, was a whodunit too.
I haven't read it,
I
actually.
haven't read the book. We just got it today, in fact.
Yeah, the book is gee, that's a nice cover. The book is a whodunit too. Indeed, the setting of part of the book is a marvelous thing if you could do it. There's a whole community of Chinese. By community, one means several million, living on ships tied up, rusting in the East River. Obviously, ships are of no use. Nobody uses them anymore. And these are Chinese who, in the book, are refugees from Formosa when the communists destroyed Formosa and took it over. The United States, this, mind you, backstory, 30 years previously, accepted this colony of however many million Chinese escaped from Formosa and brought them here, and then things were beginning to go down and they ended up leaving them on these ships, and they live there, much as these people live in our streets. And the fugitive in the story, in the book, is one of these Chinese, and it would be, but impossibly found. You know, you have to deal with certain pragmatic problems often in translating a novel to film.
This is, of course, is the big difficulty with science fiction, being faithfully transmitted and even being done at all, because of course the imagination is limitless on paper, but when it comes to actually
Indeed, what I hope very much is that we can, what we considered as the main problem, we didn't really regret deeply dispensing with this fascinating colony of Chinese living on several thousand rusting freighters. However interesting a setting that would be, one says, well, you can't shoot that, let's do something else. But what we conceived of as the main problem in filming this piece is how to suggest, with a feasible number of extras, the look of New York with 40 million people in it. And if we bring that off, I'll be delighted. Now, what we try and do is use many confined sets. For instance, the stairway in the old brownstone building. But the stairwell, which one presumes is more or less public property, on the 2 or 3 times you see me climbing up and down the stairs, is literally crammed with people sleeping. And so that you can hardly find a place to put your foot down. And at the top of the stairs is a guard with a gun to keep them from going further than the stairway from the street. Anyway, they sleep in the windows of stores. They sleep on fire escapes. They sleep in stairways of the buildings. They can't sleep in the rooms because those are assigned to people that have jobs. They sleep in churches. They sleep in the derelict cars parked along the streets. You may have noticed in the street some of the cars even have little stovepipes coming out of them. And that is, I hope we can give a feeling of the numbers, because that's what it's about, really.
Be interesting.
The heat, the sun's heat comes through, but doesn't escape off.
With the carbon dioxide.
Yes, and you finally get kind of a greenhouse quality with this constant, somewhat humid, ongoing heat all year round, summer and winter. And so we're presuming this, so it's always sweat. Yeah. Be appalling, wouldn't it? God save us all from it.
What's your next project?
I'm doing a production of The Crucible at the Amundsen downtown, which will be pleasant for me. I haven't done a play for 4 years.
What was the last thing? Manfred Seasons?
Manfred Seasons, yeah. I think The Crucible is arguably Miller's best play, with the possible exception of Death of a Salesman. I don't think many people would advance other claims. And very good piece, very playable. Stage. I like films. You can learn a great deal from films, and it's creative work, but it primarily belongs to the director. Whereas, conversely, the stage is actor's country. And, I guess I'm going back to get my passport stamped.
Your passport is done.
We've just been talking as we came along about the fact that there are still politicians, still police, still detectives in this story. And what I can't understand is you've got this tremendous population problem, and yet you in the film are investigating murders. I mean, I'd have thought by this time human life would have been so cheap.
Well,
this
as
wouldn't
the
matter.
police lieutenant says in the story, when he pulls him off a murder investigation on which he has been for 2 days, and the guy says, but it's, I'm making progress. He says, yeah. He says, and there have been 340 murders in New York since then, and we won't solve them either, I believe very strongly that the pressures of population are at the root of most of the problems in the modern world. In just this way, simply the crush of numbers. I think the womb is a far more dangerous element in modern life than the bomb, infinitely more. And I hope the film will convey it. I think you can hardly pick out a 20th century problem, international, or even a problem peculiar to one country, which cannot in some way be traced back to population. Civil rights, problems of the aged, union problems, problems of pollution, even international pressures between countries, frictions between countries.
Sweet things.
Yes, the inevitable pressure China will very soon be putting on Hong Kong. which they would now if they didn't need the trade.
Yes.
You know, it's because of their enormously expanding population. Why does Russia need the wheat? Because their population's expanding. Hi, Russ.
Hi. They would like to do sort of a running shot of you two talking as you walk past past the action. Would that suit you?
Sure, fine.
Okay. So anytime you're ready to go.
Well, now should I'm doing, I'm double booked, which he did unremittingly.
And also to allow you to feed off him.
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
it was an incredible, so kind of symbiotic relationship, but only unfortunately going for him as far as he could, because he couldn't actually get any air.
Must have been, my God, an almost sexual frustration. You know, you take the girl out and take her to dinner and buy her a corsage and champagne, and then take her to the bedroom door and hand it over to somebody else. It's really terrible.
People were very quick to nitpick on your film, Antony and Cleopatra. For instance, with Cleopatra, they always do the historical films. They always find, a little loophole that they can, a historical fact or thing which you might have misjudged, and then immediately attack that, completely missing the film.
Yeah. I think, of course, you must expect, in Harry Truman's lovely phrase, it certainly applies to doing the great plays. If you can't stand the heat, stay out of the kitchen. You have to expect, if you're undertaking one of Shakespeare's great plays, that you're going to be dealt with harshly. You can't. I was extremely careful on there was some historical question, but they were all incorrect questions.
I noticed in the Los Angeles Times you.
Oh, did you read
wrote,
the correspondence on that?
Cleopatra.
Well, it's curious. There are a few people who imagine Cleopatra to have been black. There are far more people who imagine her to have been Egyptian. Of course, she was neither. She was Greek. And there simply is no possibility of debate on the point. It's not open to question. Contrary to what the man whose letter I wrote in response to seemed to believe, there is no theatrical tradition for playing Shakespeare's Cleopatra as black. But there is a strong tradition to play her in Egyptian dress, which is wrong too. There is historical record to the contrary. It seems to me that's what, of course, Shakespeare is universal and means everything, but among the things he means when he has her say, "Bring me my robe, put on my crown and all," I'm again for sitting to meet Mark Antony, that she is donning Egyptian dress for a symbolic occasion, a ritual occasion, which is when she wore it. And that the rest of the time she wore Greek dress. I think audiences and to a certain extent critics were nevertheless bothered by the fact that we had Hildegard in Greek hairstyles and Greek chitons most of the time. They imagined that they were bothered by Hildegard, but I think the image looked wrong to them.
Yeah.
They expected to see her standing sideways in those braided black wigs all the time.
Yes, I still remember the Guardian's, you must have seen the Guardian's headline about you from the biggest asp disaster in the world.
Yes, I remember it vividly.
But I think, of course, the thing is you
That exact remark was made when some years ago, when I played Macbeth at the Bermuda Shakespeare Festival. Burgess Meredith directed it, and
So Burgess Meredith.
Yeah. And we went there to start rehearsals, and the theater people gave a cocktail party for the local people, And as you probably know, Bermudians are more stiffly British than the British are. And this
Scots are always worse than English and so forth.
Yeah, this archetypical colonial grande dame swept down on me, where I stood quietly sucking on a scotch, and she said, "Tell me, young man, why would an American actor want to play Shakespeare?" And I was younger at the time, and I couldn't think of anything to say. I said, "Well, it's a very good part."
Because the irony is, which they never realise, is of course that the Elizabethan would have sounded more American than
Well,
British.
that's a point in fact. Now, when I played Gordon in Khartoum, I went to great pains and to do all that I could to speak not quite like a modern Englishman, but like a 19th century professional military man, and seemed to have squeaked by with it. There seemed to be there was a great deal of criticism on the announcement of the casting, but the British press was uncommonly kind to me on the film itself. But when I do Shakespeare, I don't do that, because Shakespeare, in the first place, most of the parts in Shakespeare are not English. Antony obviously is not English. You're speaking English because English is the international language of the theater, and it's the language of Shakespeare, but it's not what, in fact, he spoke Latin, obviously. And in the second place, even if you're doing an English role in Shakespeare, one of the English roles, Elizabethans didn't, as you just said, Elizabethans didn't speak English like modern Englishmen. Elizabethan English was just as far from modern English as it is from modern American.
Sword is sword.
Yes, all kinds of very cute. As a matter of fact, I spoke to a speech expert once, a semanticist, who said that he was convinced that the closest thing to Elizabethan English now spoken in the world. Now, he said this more than 20 years ago, and television has since then penetrated there, and it probably isn't even true there. But at that time, he said the closest thing to Elizabethan English spoken in the modern world was in the hills of Tennessee.
Yes,
Some of the Smoky Mountains,
the
where
slang
there's
is supposed to be about the same
yes.
as it was in about the 18th
much
century.
of it, yes. And because some of the migrations, the English migrations to the colonies mostly occurred in the 17th and 18th centuries, and there were enclaves in the hills of Tennessee and Kentucky and North Carolina that remained remarkably encapsulated well into the 20th century, and where the speech patterns and usages, idioms, remained much as they had. I can't argue the point, but it's just plausible. You listen to some of the Kentucky Mountain folk singers recorded in the 30s, the very old ones, and singing indeed Elizabethan songs. Many of their songs are English folk songs, in fact, Lord Granville and all that, and they sound quite. You can see the point. The whole, I've long been fascinated. I've done so many period parts in my career, and came belatedly to realize after I'd left school that history is the best subject, and have become very preoccupied with the problems of recreating a period in film or on the stage. And
I don't think it's hardly ever been done. I mean, if you really think about language-wise, moral, things like costume, cleanliness, and all that sort of thing, it's almost impossible to do it. An audience wouldn't accept it. They couldn't accept it.
What you find usually is done is they will write, a writer or playwright will write a period, often trying to recreate its physical milieu accurately.
Yeah, this is what you were saying.
But the mores and attitudes are completely modern.
Exactly.
Completely modern, which to me, I find very clashing, really. because it does away with the entire thing. I don't know why it stands out so much in my mind, but there was a film on telly about a year ago. This was in Britain. What was the name of it? Anyway, it was about. I'm sorry, I keep doing this type of thing. It's about the Greece anyway, and
The Lion of Sparta, was that 300 Spartans with Richard Egan, wasn't it?
That's it.
It's one about
Oh
the
yes, I know that.
Peloponnesian.
And the thing is that they couldn't have been more historically inaccurate if they had tried. I mean, if someone had said, "Well, we'll try and do an antithetical thing," they could have done better, you know.
Oh yes, it's terrible. And every film, practically on in the medieval period or the Roman period or Restoration, they'll be nattering on about the freedom of man and we must free the slaves. And in fact, in those periods, nobody gave a thought.
About the slaves, no.
Never crossed their minds about the
in
slaves.
fact, the thought of not having slavery wouldn't occur to them.
No.
I mean, it would have been like saying,
Aristotle and Socrates, probably some of the most profound human beings that ever walked the earth, never opened their mouths about slavery.
Well, they did. Actually, Aristotle did open his mouth about slavery, and he said that it was obvious that most people are made to be slaves outside the Greeks. You know?
I mean about it as an injustice.
Oh no,
as
never.
As an outrageous human
Never.
condition.
Never.
No. I made a film with Walter Seltzer a few years ago, which Frank Schaffner directed it.
Oh, The Warlord.
The Warlord.
Marvelous. Now that was one of the
that was
very
good.
few.
Yeah.
It didn't turn out quite as well as we hoped, although Frank Schaffner's first cut was pretty close to what we hoped. But by God, that is a film that accurately reproduces
It's
the
the only
11th
one.
century,
Really,
not only,
really good.
It's one
and
of the
also
few,
the
yeah.
mores.
Yes.
I
And
mean,
some-
no, the serfs never say, gee, we shouldn't be serfs, let's rise up. They say, well, he's a knight, he has a right, you know. And now there again, if you like, was the alienated man. A man rendered
completely.
cold by a lifetime
Yeah.
in armor.
Exactly.
When he's arguing with the girl, and he says, he talks about his sword, and he says, I've spent 20 years with that cold bride.
Yeah.
And
And the coldness of the castle, not the usual glamorous Douglas
but a
Fairbanks castle, the
dank little
clammy.
smelly tower.
Exactly.
You know,
And you had Richard Boone. You could almost smell Richard Boone,
Yes.
couldn't you? Tremendous. And the boy dangling over the side, complete.
Yes,
I mean, probably they would have just chucked him over and
Sure.
anyway.
That
That was a really fine film. It could. I mean, obviously there were things that could have been better, but given the context of the.
A lot of it worked.
But also Major Dundee too. That was a very good picture, given the fact
Gee.
it was so.
That was the two pictures are good cases in point. They were made very close to one another, for one thing, and both made by directors of considerable talent. Both flawed films. Sure, that's a direct outside line. It's not
So
a
if I
call the studio. But whereas, as I told you, I think Warlord in Frank Schaffner's first cut before the studio, in our judgment, altered it to its great detriment, was 80% of what we hoped, which is a lot.
Majorly was changed.
Period lock on you. And it seemed to me that it was only in these terms, what you found implausible, that he would keep her, in the face of all common sense, could be made plausible. And there were scenes, not really scenes, but just shots and textures within scenes that I thought made this clear that they cut. But conversely, Major Dundee, the director got to make over. I think the film Sam really wanted to make with Major Dundee was The Wild Bunch.
Which I thought was very poor. I thought it was vastly inferior to Major
Do
Dundee.
you really?
I thought Major Dundee was a film very civilized. I thought the conflict between the two men was electric, exciting.
That's interesting. Didn't you feel that structurally it came
Well, of course,
apart?
see, I went to it expecting it to be a disappointment because of what I'd heard about
Yeah,
it, you see. So if
well-
I'd gone, and I went to Wild Bunch with high hopes, so you know,
yeah.
you just never know. But
See, I had such high hopes for Dundee, and it was a bitter, grinding frustration to have it seem to come apart like a wet bag, paper bag in your hands, and feel that everybody had put so much sweat and damn near blood into it, and God knows tears, and to have it not be what you wanted was, my calluses are thicker now. I can accept the fact that it hardly ever turns out quite as marvelously as you hope, but I didn't feel that then.
But what would happen if the studio wanted to recut the film you're making now? I mean, say you had a cut which you were satisfied with, and the studio wanted to cut it in such a way that it would compromise the basic situation.
Well-
Now, what could you do?
This is the classic filmmaker's dilemma, and it has to do with the rights of property, and it is simply something that is an inescapable fact of filmmaking as an art form, and that is that the artist does not own the raw materials. If I'm a painter and I buy $7 worth of canvas and paint and do a painting, and I take it to someone, a dealer or a private buyer, and say, what do you think? And he says, Jesus, that's marvelous, except couldn't you paint a little figure in the back here, maybe a figure of me? I can either say, well, screw you, and take it away and not sell it, as Andrew Wyeth keeps many of his paintings that he doesn't want to sell, or sell it to somebody else, or as Renaissance artists often did, say, sure, happy to, and paint the figure of the guy in and sell it. But the painter has the option to do as he likes. The filmmaker has to go to someone and say, look, I got this idea for a film, but it's going to cost $1,800,000. Or let's say it's a tiny little simple film. It still is going to cost $750,000. He isn't going to be able to pay for it himself. Somebody has to pay for it. Now, no matter how much you bitch about it, as I just bitched about Universal on The Warlord, I bitched about it. I said they were wrong. I didn't say they had no right to do it. The film belongs to them. I would hope that won't happen here. Our experience on Skyjacked was flawless. They looked at the film. They had a few suggestions while we were shooting. Suggestion on cast, saying, no, we don't think we want to pay that much for this girl. Or how about if you use this person, or couldn't this be that? And some of the things you say, okay. Or some of the things you say, no, Jesus, how about this and the other, and can't we do this? And you solve that. Then you finish the film. In the case of Skyjacked, we did the cut and showed it to them. They came in and looked at it and said, fine, marvelous. Obviously, we hope they'll do that on this. If they don't, if they say, Jesus, I think that scene with the girl, that doesn't work. No, God.
Also, a lot of times they'll do in screenings the so-called studios version and the so-called
That's right.
director's version. And
But
which plays
finally,
better and
you see, finally, the film is the physical property of the studio. Now, you know, I laugh ruefully because I've screamed myself, but I have never said they don't have a right to change it. I've said they're idiots, they're insensitive brutes, they don't know what the hell they're doing, but you can't say they don't have a right to because they paid for it.
Take your shirt off in this film.
Yeah, once or twice.
Do they? Is that in your contract or something? Do they always ask you for it so that you take your shirt off?
No, I think I expose myself rather less than most actors in films these days.
Well, I don't know. Your backside was very evident in Planet of the
That's
Apes,
true.
wasn't it?
However, as I have said, I think nudity in films is a vastly overrated and largely misunderstood commodity, and almost never works to erotic effect. I think, which everyone imagined it would, including me, when we got what was described as the new freedom of films. Everyone thought, boy, we're certainly going to have some exciting love scenes. It's going to be marvelous. In fact, it isn't. I don't think I've ever seen an erotic scene in film that was
Blow Up was very erotic. I don't know why it was. It just
but that was comic. See, that was partly comic effect, wasn't it? You mean when the girls are rolling around in the paper?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could I get your gun and holster, sir?
Yeah.
Have you wrapped? Did you
Pardon?
wrap?
Are they
It's a
wrapping?
wrap, uh-huh.
My God.
Thank you
Didn't
very
tell me.
much.
I want to finish this point, though. But I think for two reasons. In the first place, nudity is really only erotic, by and large, when you're experiencing it, when you're involved in it. Now, of course, depending on to what extent one has voyeuristic tendencies, it can have other excitements. But its real excitement is one of personal involvement, not sitting in a house looking at somebody in the screen. In the second place, although, as we all are aware, the naked human body is one of the most beautiful objects ever made, only in certain attitudes, as I think Lord Chesterfield wrote to his son about sex. He says, to begin with, the attitude is ridiculous. Which, of course, is quite true. The sight of a naked woman lying on a bed in the odalisque pose can be an object of breathtaking beauty. The sight of the same woman being screwed is apt to be ridiculous, whatever else it may be. But that, because the posture becomes, in Lord Chesterfield's quite accurate phrase, ridiculous. Now, you can use nudity, as we did in Apes, for quite another effect. I can think, as I said at the time, at that time that scene had to be argued through the front office, and I pled for it with all the eloquence at my command. And I
How
said,
did you manage that? I mean, with your own body as being the commodity you were pleading for.
well, I said, I challenge you to show me another way in which we can better demonstrate the animal quality of man in this society than to have him stand naked in a room full of apes, and his nudity is no more important to them than a dog's nakedness would be. And that was, of course, the point of the scene.
Yeah.
And I think it worked in those terms. But nudity to make an erotic point, I have frankly never seen work in a film. Really work. It sometimes will get by, but it's always teetering on the edge of the grotesque.
I think the only nudity I've seen that's been really convincing has been in the Andy Warhol films and the Paul Morrissey films, because it shows everything. I mean, there's no discrete camera angles. I mean, it's everything. It's ugly. It shows it in its ugly situation,
yes,
and it's
but
beautiful
if you-
as well. So you get the both. It doesn't try
But
to
my
be beautiful.
point was, certainly if you want to show it, if your point is to show the grotesqueness or the demeaning quality or the alienation of sex, which it can have these, a relationship can of course have these qualities too. Of course you can do it. If you'll recall, my comment was you can almost never achieve a genuinely erotic effect.
No.
To put it quite simply, if the woman's lying naked in the bed all by herself, that can look marvelous. If she reaches up her legs and puts them around the guy, it begins to look grotesque.
Don't you sometimes think that maybe sex has taken, has replaced, well, I hate to use the word, but love. I mean, I hate to use the word because it doesn't have much meaning anymore. But I mean, should we say, basic communication and so forth in love. I mean, that's what I mean.
Yes. They use sexual scenes in films now as a shorthand for excitement, the way they often use violence. I think both sex and violence are frequently used by untalented jerks as a substitute for talent.
Yeah. This is what annoyed me so much in The Amiga Man, that the good things of the film were completely shunted aside to have the bed scene and the violence and all this sort of thing.
Yes, I think it can often work that way.
But I still think it's the quality of the performance that creates the erotic atmosphere. I mean, if you're involved with the character, then it is perhaps erotic to see them take their clothes off.
Again, this came up in Antony and Cleopatra, which obviously involves what is traditionally regarded as one of the great love affairs of history. And they said, you're going to have nude scenes. And I said, if Shakespeare could write this love story with a boy playing Cleopatra, I said, if you can't make this love story work without having Cleopatra take her clothes off, you really are an amateur. And which is an illustration of what you were talking about. Hey, I think they did wrap.
Thanks very, very much.